Shock and Awesome is the first wing in the Liberation of Undermine raid. It is home to the Cauldron of Carnage and Rik Reverb. Very quickly going to describe how this guide is set up. The video is split into chapters for each boss. You can find them down below. The first chapter will describe the boss fight mechanics and each of the important abilities. The second chapter will be role-specific duties. LFR and Normal are practically identical, but I will make a note on differing areas. Cauldron of Carnage. This is a single-phase fight with a brief intermission. There are two bosses, Florendo, the T-Rex, and Torq, the Gorilla. The raid needs to be split into two groups as the bosses need to be tanked away from each other. Both bosses apply a stacking debuff, so after the intermission ends, the raid will switch sides to reset their stacks. During the intermission, the bosses fight each other in the center of the arena. They throw a bunch of effects around, so you'll have to watch your feet. They take full damage during this, so don't slack off on the DPS. Finally, both bosses need to be cleaved down together as the last boss standing will enrage and damage will quickly start ramping. Phase 1. Once engaged, both bosses will apply a stacking debuff. Blistering Spite if you're with Florendo and Galvanized Spite if you're with Torq. Florendo has two mechanics. Scrap Bomb. This is a large bomb and it needs to be soaked. It will also knock those soaking players back once it explodes. His other ability is a Roar Cannon attack. He locks onto and tracks a player as he charges. Once he's ready, he stops and fires. This is lethal, so be sure to aim it away from your party. His tank ability is called Eruption Stomp. This will knock the tank up into the air and send out fire waves from that impact location. Torq has a unique ability called Static Charge. An extra bar will appear underneath your character. When you move, this bar fills. If it fills completely, you'll be stunned for 6 seconds. Moving around will fill your bar, and standing still will deplete it. His other ability, Thunder Drum Salvo, will shoot missiles at all players. Move around to avoid, but watch your static bar. His tank ability, Lightning Bash, deals physical damage, and 100% of that damage that's unmitigated is an additional hit of nature damage, so tanks pop a defensive before he hits you. Phase 1's abilities. Blistering and Galvanized Spite. Florendo and Torq apply these stacking debuffs every 5 seconds to all players that are within 60 yards of them. Florendo deals fire damage, and Torq does nature. This debuff lasts for 15 seconds. Raised Guard. When both bosses are within 40 yards of each other, their damage taken is reduced by 99%. This buff is disabled during the intermission. King of Carnage. When one boss is defeated, the surviving boss quickly enrages. Their damage increases every 5 seconds, 10% if you're on LFR and 50% if you're on normal. Let's cover the individual abilities. Florendo. Scrap Bomb. A giant bomb that must be soaked. This knocks back players that are inside once it explodes. Blast Burn Roar Cannon. Florendo will lock onto a target while charging and track them. Once charged, he stops and fires a concentrated beam over 3 seconds that pretty much kills any player in its path. Eruption Stomp. This is the tank buster. It knocks the tank into the air, dealing damage. Fire waves will also radiate out from that impact zone. Torq's abilities. Static Charge and Static Discharge. This is shown on the bar beneath your character. It fills by moving and drains by standing still. While moving, it deals damage to you, and if it reaches full, it stuns the player for 6 seconds. Thunder Drum Salvo. Torq will rapidly fire a salvo of missiles for 6 seconds at all players. These are marked by circles. Sidestep to avoid, but avoid filling your bar. Lightning Bash. This is the tank buster, deals heavy physical damage, and whatever damage isn't mitigated will also hit as nature damage. The intermission. At 100 energy, Florendo and Torq charge to the center of the arena and duke it out for 20 seconds. During the clash, there's a few things to be aware of. First, Raised Guard isn't active, so the raid should continue to DPS. Second, the raid will suffer damage every second. Third, fire waves and lightning circles are everywhere and need to be avoided. Finally, each clash increases in damage by 15%. Once the clash is over, both groups should swap sides to reset your debuff stacks. So if you were fighting Torq, you're now fighting Florendo, and if you were fighting Florendo, now you're fighting Torq. The intermission's abilities. Colossal Clash. This is initiated once they reach 100 energy. Florendo and Torq collide in the center, dealing raid damage every second for 20 seconds. Each clash increases in damage by 15%. Zap Bolt. Torq summons lightning strikes around the arena, which are marked by circles. Fiery Wave. Florendo sends out these waves from his location and they need to be avoided. Role-specific duties. Tanks. Keep the bosses apart. Use a defensive before Eruption Stomp and especially before Lightning Bash. During the intermission, swap bosses once the clash ends. Healers. Expect ramping raid damage as Blistering and Galvanized Spite stacks increase. Expect a burst of damage during the Scrap Bomb Soak. Expect constant damage during Thunder Drum Salvo as people move around. During the intermission, expect raid damage every second until it ends. Don't forget to switch sides. DPS. Help soak the Scrap Bomb if you're on Florendo's side. If you're on Torq's side, don't fill your static charge bar fully. Make sure you're cleaving both bosses evenly. Swap sides if you need extra damage. During the intermission, avoid all the circles and make sure that you switch sides. Rik Reverb. This is a single phase fight with a brief intermission when the boss reaches 100 energy. The main thing to be aware of here is the boss will place amplifiers around the arena. These have a charge bar above them, and the raid needs to keep draining them to prevent them from fully charging. The intermission consists of running to different amplifiers to avoid the boss's deadly ring ability. Phase 1. The boss will need to be continuously moved around the arena. He will use amplification, which places an amplifier underneath of him and somewhere else in the arena. These amplifiers have a bar above them which shows their charge level, and if it fills completely, it will do massive raid damage. If the boss is close to one of these amplifiers, he will cause it to charge faster, so he needs to stay away. In order to drain an amplifier, players must interact with them. While draining, players will suffer damage every second, so make sure you pop a defensive. Each of these amplifiers, in general, pulses raid damage every 2 seconds, so healers should keep that in mind as the amount of amplifiers increases. The boss will also use Echoing Chant. This will send out multiple sound waves from each amplifier, and they need to be dodged. He will occasionally use Sound Cannon, which targets a random player with a large frontal cone. His final attack is Faulty Zap. This places circles around random players, dealing damage, so just keep spaced out. For tanks, each melee hit by the boss applies a stacking debuff. You'll want to taunt swap around 7 to 9 stacks, depending on the amount of damage. Also note that the boss's melee attacks hit in a frontal cone, so keep the boss facing away from the raid. Phase 1's abilities. Amplification. This deploys an amplifier underneath of the boss's current location and at another random location. Amplifiers. These gain power over time and need to be drained. They inflict damage to players that are draining them. Each amplifier also pulses raid damage every 2 seconds. Echoing Chant. Sound waves will radiate out from the amplifiers. These waves apply a 6-second dot that can stack. Sound Cannon. This targets a random player with a cone attack. Faulty Zap. This is shown by a circle around random players. It deals damage over 12 seconds. It also applies a debuff, increasing damage taken by 75% for 12 seconds. Sonic Blast. All melee hits are a frontal cone attack and apply a stacking debuff which increases damage taken for 10 seconds. The intermission. Once reaching 100 energy, the boss begins Hype Hustle. The boss will shield himself and fly up into the air, activating one of the amplifiers with a blue ring. The raid must run to this amplifier before the boss uses his blaring drop. He will smash into the ground, sending out a ring which is lethal. Before that ring reaches players, the amplifier that is activated will explode, knocking players up and over top of that ring, thus avoiding the damage. Find the next activated amplifier and continue until the intermission ends. Phase 1 will then resume. Just a note, if Rik reaches a third Hype Hustle, it results in a wipe. So it is a little bit of a DPS race. Intermission's abilities. Sound Cloud. This shields the boss, reducing all damage taken by 99%. Blowout. An amplifier goes haywire and knocks players into the air, granting them immunity from the Blaring Drop ring. Blaring Drop. The boss slams into the ground, sending out a sonic wave from his location, which deals fatal damage. Hype Fever. This is triggered on the third intermission and wipes the raid. Role-specific duties. Tanks. Keep the boss facing away from the raid. Keep the boss away from amplifiers. Swap around 7 to 9 stacks unless that damage feels a little too high for you. Healers. The raid takes increasing damage per active amplifier. Players draining amplifiers will take increased damage. During the intermission, each knock-up from an amplifier will deal a burst of raid damage. DPS. Make sure you stay behind the boss. Use defenses when you're draining amplifiers. Don't drain an amplifier if you're hit with the Faulty Zap due to the 12-second debuff. Congratulations, you just cleared the first wing of the Liberation of Undermine raid. Shout out to these channel members. If this video helped them, press the thumbs up. Subscribe if you enjoy WoW content. I have plenty of guides, tips and tricks, podcasts, and more. You can show extra support by becoming a channel member. It's 99 cents a month and gives you early ad-free access to all my videos. Don't forget to check out the merch store. I'll see you in Wing 2.